The number should have terrified me, but it didn't. 500,000. 500,000 people moved across a continent over 75 years, and the machinery that moved them operated in such plain sight that it became invisible, like a railroad timetable everyone memorized and then stopped noticing. I didn't find it while hunting for conspiracies. I stumbled into it the way you stumble into an abandoned room in a familiar house, researching something else entirely, tugging on one thread, then another, until I was holding something so expansive I couldn't see the edges anymore. 500,000 is a headline number, the kind you can repeat without feeling its weight. But the number that keeps me awake is smaller. 250,000 of them were children, not teenagers with a stubborn sense of self, but children with just enough memory to know their names, and just enough softness to have those names peeled away. Children young enough to be reshaped completely, young enough to forget, young enough to become someone else entirely because the person they were simply ceased to exist in any official record. Between 1,854 and 1,929. Trains carried children out of the streets of New York, out of Boston's tenements, out of the slums of Philadelphia and Baltimore. Children whose parents had died, or disappeared, or were swallowed by a city that could grind a family down faster than it could register the loss. In an era when industrial centers drowned in their own excess coal smoke. Cholera. Overcrowding these children became a problem needing a solution. And the solution was simple. Take them away. Put them somewhere else. Give them to someone who could use them. Distribute them like goods across the nation. Keep almost no record of where they went. The story begins, officially, with Charles Loring Brace, a Yale-educated minister who walked New York's streets and saw children sleeping in alleys, forming gangs for survival, or arrested and thrown into adult prisons as young as 5. In 1853, he founded the Children's Aid Society, and he believed sincerely that distance and moral rural life could do what the city would not. Take children out of cities, move them to farming communities of the Midwest and West, place them with families who needed labor and could provide a disciplined upbringing. The trains would carry them. The platform would become the marketplace. The families would be the customers. The first train left New York on the 1st of October 1854, carrying 46 children to Michigan. By week's end, all were placed. Over 20 separate agencies eventually participated. Over 75 years, the trains kept running. The official narrative says many found good homes. Some became governors. A survey in 1910 claimed an 87% success rate. A statistic that reads clean on paper and collapses the moment you ask what counted as success and who was allowed to answer. Brace genuinely believed he was saving lives. And in many cases, he probably was. I don't have to deny the good to be haunted by the mechanism. What troubles me is not the few celebrated survivors whose stories are easy to publish. What troubles me is the silence surrounding the math that doesn't add up. New York City in 1850 had roughly 500,000 people. Estimates say 10,000 to 30,000 were homeless children. That's 2 to 6% of the entire city is parentless children. And even that number is slippery because poverty is hard to count and easy to hide. Then, by the 1870s, after orphanages and charitable organizations, including the Children's Aid Society itself, worked around the clock, the number of homeless children grew to 20,000 to 30,000. The programs weren't reducing the problem. The supply kept increasing. The trains kept running, but children kept appearing. Where were they coming from? On paper, immigration has manifests, processing stations, family units. People arrived together. Parents didn't step off ships carrying children as inventory and then evaporate en masse. If these children arrived in America with parents, something happened after arrival, something widespread and systematic enough to produce 250,000 children whose origins couldn't be traced. Their names changed. Their histories were erased. Their pasts were sealed behind institutions that outlived them. Archives locked more than a century later, with rules that treat a child's identity as a proprietary secret. And then there's the parallel that refuses to stay quiet. If you include the British Home Children Program, operating from 1869 to 1948, relocating more than 100,000 children from the United Kingdom to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa under nearly identical conditions, the number climbs past 350,000. Same decades, same methods, Same pattern of children labeled orphans, even though many had at least one living parent. Same untraceable origins. Same sealed records. Two parallel programs on two continents producing the same result is not coincidence. It's a pattern. The National Orphan Train complex maintains a database of just over 8,000 confirmed riders out of an estimated 250,000. 3%. 3% of 250,000. And it isn't because descendants didn't care. It's because the trail turns to ash. The New York Foundling Hospital sent around 100,000 children, and its surviving records are often described as practically non-existent. Children pulled from streets with no family documentation. Names changed multiple times. When they arrived at new homes, the erasure was completed. Identity removed systematically. I tried to convince myself it was ordinary bureaucratic decay. Paper rots. Ink fades. Clerks make mistakes. But the gaps have edges. They are too clean in the wrong places. Sealed where you would expect openness, and absent where you would expect routine. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The era wasn't undocumented. It was obsessively documented. The United States was building what would become one of the world's most comprehensive census systems. The 1,890 census was among the most detailed population surveys ever conducted. Each household received its own dedicated form. It collected information on immigration status, naturalization, English proficiency, home ownership, race, household composition, and relationships to the head of household. It captured about 63 million people during the exact peak of the Orphan Train era. Highest placement rates occurred roughly from 1882 to 1892. In some states, huge portions of new children arrived in that decade. The census should have documented precisely where these children were living, who they were living with, and whether the story of their origins matched the story of the adults who claimed them. That census was destroyed. A fire on the 10th of January 1921 in a Commerce Department basement damaged or destroyed the population schedules. Some burned outright. Others were soaked in water and smoke. The Census Bureau estimated it would take years to salvage them. They never truly started. The records sat in storage, deteriorating, and then, in 1932, surviving schedules were quietly added to a routine destruction list. Congress authorized the destruction on the 23rd of February 1933. The very next day, they laid the cornerstone for the new National Archives building. Of 63 million people enumerated, only a tiny fraction survives. This was the first census without backup copies at local offices. No redundancy. No second set of books kept in county drawers. No local mirror to contradict a federal loss. One census, arguably the single most genealogically valuable snapshot of the country, covering the exact years when 250,000 unidentified children were redistributed across the nation, and it vanished. If you're looking for a clean historical narrative, the Orphan Trains offer one. Charitable reformers rescue desperate children, give them fresh starts. But the way it worked in practice looks less like adoption and more like a logistics system. When trains arrived at towns, the children were taken to courthouses, opera houses, church halls. Flyers had been posted weeks in advance. Homes for children wanted. The children were put on display in lines. They were asked to give their names, to sing songs, to recite a verse, to perform their usefulness. Townspeople selected them. Researchers and writers have described it the same way over and over. People prodding them, inspecting their hands, checking their teeth. One writer said they interviewed us like a cattle auction. A newspaper in 1912 described adults ordering boys or girls, preferring lighter babies or darker ones, weighing temperament and hair and height like a purchase. Siblings were separated routinely. Brothers watched as sisters were chosen and taken away. Unchosen children got back on the train to the next town until someone picked them or the route ran out. Many never saw their families again. The phrase, "put up for adoption," didn't just appear as metaphor. It was literal. Children on platforms for selection. Legal documents use the word indenture, not adoption. Indenture, the same word used for contracted servitude. People wanted labor. A child sent back 3 times before a 4th family kept him wasn't returned because he misbehaved. He was returned because he was too small for farm work. It is possible, even likely, that many homes were kind. It is also true that the system was designed to ignore the child's consent, to treat identity as a negotiable detail, to make origin optional. That is why so many stories end in a blank. I kept trying to find the missing document, a government report, a comprehensive study, a verified chain of custody for 250,000 human lives. It doesn't exist in a form that answers the question it should answer. Annual reports claim success without verifiable source data. Organizations didn't coordinate statistics. Many agencies never published full numbers. Records were lost, destroyed, or sealed. Descendants today, millions of them carry gaps in family trees that were not lost accidentally, but never recorded, or recorded and then locked away. And the more I looked, the more the timeline began to align with other silences. The 8th of October, 1871. Multiple catastrophic fires ignited across the Great Lakes region. The Chicago fire destroyed thousands of buildings and left tens of thousands homeless. The same night, to the north, the Peshtigo fire consumed more than 1 million acres and killed an estimated 1,500 to 2,000. 500 people, one of the deadliest wildfires in U.S. history. Other fires raged in Michigan and Wisconsin. Communities vanished. Local records burned. Church registers, town ledgers, family Bibles, deeds, and the small paper trails that made a person legible to a bureaucrat. Into that void, children with no traceable origins flooded by the thousands. If you want to believe in coincidence, you can stack it like cordwood. Poverty, immigration, disease, fire, sloppiness, bad luck. But coincidence has a texture. It's messy, irregular, distributed. This is something else. This is a corridor of vanishing documentation that runs alongside a corridor of child relocation, and it keeps turning at the same corners. Even the strange side alleys of the era echo it. Between the late 1890s and the mid-20th century, premature infants were displayed in glass incubators at World's Fairs and amusement parks. A doctor-entrepreneur model, babies in incubators, admission fee, anonymous infants behind glass. The operator claimed to have treated thousands. Hospitals at the time often refused to treat premature babies, calling them too weak to save. So these exhibits became both spectacle and care. But anonymity was part of the system. Names withheld, origins blurred. The supply never seemed to run out. Where did thousands of anonymous infants come from? Why did the pipeline persist for decades? Why does the question feel impolite to ask? I didn't discover these questions in a university archive alone. I found them where modern people go when official systems refuse to answer, on platforms that reward obsession. It started with a late-night search, then a comment thread, then another thread. A TikTok video stitched with grainy photos of children lined up at a depot, overlaid with a caption that read, "My great-grandma said they changed her name 3 times." The comments were a chorus. Same. My grandpa never knew his birth date. We did DNA and hit a wall. The agency sent us a letter with everything blacked out. On Reddit, in genealogy subforums, people trade tips like they're passing contraband, which state archives respond, which church registries are digitized, which county clerk will photocopy an old ledger if you phrase the request right. In Facebook groups with names like Orphan Train Descendants and Home Children Research, you can watch strangers build each other's family trees from crumbs. An initial on a gravestone, a mention in a farm journal, a handwritten note tucked into a Bible. Someone posts a photograph of a boy with a label pinned to his coat and asks, "Does anyone recognize this station?" And a dozen people reply with maps, train routes, and empathy like a lantern in a dark room. These platforms don't replace archives. They reveal what archives have done. They have turned identity into a puzzle that families must solve in public, because the paper trail is hidden. The internet has become a second census, built from fragments and grief. People compare DNA matches across continents and time zones, matching strangers by shared segments of code, while official records remain locked behind institutional policies written by people long dead. And it isn't just the sorrow. It's the repetition. The same phrases recur across decades and continents. They said she was an orphan, but she wasn't. They wouldn't let him write home. Her file is sealed. The agency changed the spelling. We were told not to ask. The modern platforms did not create the mystery. They simply made the pattern visible. The way a blacklight reveals stains you didn't know were there. That's the part I can't shake. The sheer scale of coordinated forgetting. 250,000 children redistributed across the country, with 97% having incomplete, missing, sealed, or destroyed records in a nation that was otherwise obsessed with counting itself. A system robust enough to move bodies like freight, but flimsy or deliberate when it came to preserving names. An era that built railroads and registries, but allowed the identity of children to slip between the ties. Maybe it was poverty. Maybe immigration waves and disease produced a massive population of children whose parents died in tenements and were buried without ceremony. Maybe there was no single source, just many tragedies adding up to a horrible total. Maybe the fires erased the proof, and what looks like intention is simply the shadow of catastrophe. Maybe the destroyed census is just bureaucratic negligence, and the sealed archives are only privacy policies surviving past their purpose. Maybe, but I know coincidence. And I know pattern, and my brain refuses to stop tracing the line. Because the question isn't only whether suffering occurred. Suffering is guaranteed. The question is what produced it at that scale, and why the records fail in the same places over and over again. What generated 250,000 children with no verifiable origins in one of the most documented eras of American history? What required their redistribution across a continent? Why do the institutions that profited morally, economically, socially from the system still control the narratives through restricted access? Why is the descendants' need to know treated as a threat? Records won't tell you, not cleanly. Institutions won't tell you, not willingly. History books mention the trains as a curious reform movement, then move on. But descendants remain. 2 to 3 million people today with gaps that don't feel accidental. They carry questions nobody answered, and they keep asking anyway in archives, in court filings, in DNA databases, in midnight comment threads. The children remember, even if history pretends it doesn't. Their names might be altered, their birthplaces might be listed as unknown, their parents might be reduced to a blank line, but the absence itself is a kind of record. Once you learn to read it, the silence becomes a map. And once you've held that map long enough, you stop asking whether there's something at the center of it. You start asking what.